economics. So, economics really is the base of culture. It's deeply entwined with all of culture, including subsistence strategies, social relationships like gender, as well as worldviews. Moreover, it is connected to important social problems, things like stratification in society, inequality, and class conflict. To begin, think about humans simply as animals, and as such, right, there are physical needs. There's needs for food, energy, and other kind of materials required to process it. And a great deal of human behavior is directed simply towards resolving those needs. It's what we call subsistence strategies. Culture, as a form of learned behavior, provides humans with different kinds of subsistence strategies. So we can think about foraging and foraging cultures, let's say. Foraging, a basic way that some peoples have collected food and materials from the natural environment. We think gathering peoples, hunting and gathering peoples, scavenging, and fishing, just as simple examples of this kind of behavior. And we know foragers work less and supply most of their basic human needs when you compare with, let's say, so-called advanced industrial societies. In fact, foragers not only work less and have access to resources to meet their needs, but they tend to be egalitarian. They tend to be some of the most equal societies where people really do share their resources. And although they've underwent great transformation in the last 50 years, the Khoisan of South Africa would be a good example of a foraging people with a way of life that is characterized by egalitarianism. But all humans are not simply subsistence, and subsistence cultures have really undergone great transformation in the modern period. Most cultures today use production. They use intensive productive techniques to resolve their basic human needs, but also to go beyond, to produce not only what is needed for basic human needs, but beyond the opening of many different kinds of human desires. So productive culture does something very important. It creates a surplus, and that surplus, that is the material things, goods, and then services that are produced, leads to increasing cultural complexity. In fact, it's closely connected to the development of things like political leadership. That is a basic form of inequality where particular individuals in the group begin to take on leadership roles and have more power, let's say, than others. And then scaling that up, right, the emergence and development of states, governments. If you think about the way agriculture, for example, it involves, right, the intensive cultivation of plants and animals. It requires technologies like irrigation and the plow. It leads to many different things, including specialization, right? You can't have those technologies. You can't have that without specialization. That is, people who are doing different kinds of things, let's say developing irrigation technologies or developing metalworking for things like plows. This specialization is part of that increasing cultural complexity, where an increasing amount of people begin to do things that are not tied directly to subsistence activities or even agriculture. It's a huge force for cultural change. If we think about industrial economics, they are some of the most productive economies that humans have ever developed. They begin to tap into other sources of energy rather than simply, let's say, human energy or non-human animal energy. If we're thinking about early forms of agriculture, let's say, that simply depend upon human and plow animal energy sources. Now we bring in the discovery of new energy sources such as petroleum and gas. And industrial economics is associated, right, with big, large, settled populations. It leads to extremely complex social and political institutions. It leads to the expansion of the built environment in some of the largest urban areas and metropolises that humans have ever developed. In fact, in industrial economics, food is quite secondary to the production of goods more generally. So the economy becomes tied to those desires much more than the basic needs for the human population. So you get extensive market exchange. And as we've been seeing in the last several decades, post-industrialism, as industrial production begins to move through processes such as globalization, whereas the United States before the 70s was an industrial economy. After the 1970s, we begin to see changes in the structure of the US economy, and then the movement of industrial production to other parts of the world, for example, China. So anthropologists are very interested in industrial economics. It is a form of economy that is very central in many different cultural changes throughout the world today. We're interested in the kinds of labor relations and conditions of industrial economics. We're interested in the kind of work that humans do under industrial economics. We're interested in post-industrialism, emergence of not just production of goods, but a whole service economy, areas that are focused on things like tourism or finance, the science and tech industries like biotechnology, internet. We're interested in a place like San Francisco, where 70% of the population don't own any land and often are engaged in wage labor in this service economy. It is quite culturally distinct from many of the other different ways of life of peoples throughout the world and time. So these kinds of economies lead to questions about distribution. So once you have production, you have a production of more than is needed at a basic subsistence level, then it raises questions of how, right, those goods are going to be distributed. As that develops, it raises questions about how services, in a service economy, will be distributed. It leads to a major shift in relationships between people in terms of class. So market economies, where a market is used in this distribution, leads to classes, that is, the people in a community, the people that make up a society, beginning to have different kinds of access to income and things like wealth, the value of the things that one owns. We begin to see these different groupings of people with different accesses to resources behave differently, interact differently. They have different rights and responsibilities and power. So we begin to see an even greater inegalitarian organization of society. So for example, lower class people who have lower income and wealth, they might, let's say, use an illegal informal market. Maybe it's a temporary vending area in a warehouse. There may be counterfeit products, there may be lower quality products, there may even be stolen goods and merchandise, for example, in areas of lower income areas of Argentina. This may be a primary means for people to get the basic resources of their life, such as food, clothing, and other kinds of materials. Just like we have production and we have distribution issues, we can think about the consumption issues that cultural anthropologists are interested in. So these ways of life, these different kinds of subsistence, these different kinds of subsistence strategies, these different kinds of economic behaviors, they shape many aspects of the way of life of a group of people. They shape aspects like class and equality. So if you think of a post-industrial society like the United States, it is true that the mass production methods and assembly lines, as they have been applied to food production, lower costs and increased profits, let's say, for owners of businesses, food industry businesses, let's say, shareholders, right? But generally, we can recognize, though, that industrialized food production has also lowered the nutritional value of food. Highly processed food is widely recognized to have a lower nutritional value. It can provide very high calories, but often empty calories. And a real cultural irony that anthropologists consider is how, in fact, it is of lesser nutritional value and providing higher numbers of empty calories than the more simple diet of a forager. So beyond needs, when we start thinking about consumption, it's much more than just energy requirements and nutrient requirements and so on. It reflects the production system of a society, the distribution system of society. It will reflect things like their class identities and the relationships between people and their values and many other aspects of culture than simply the need for nutrients and energy. So in conclusion, economics really is deeply intertwined with culture. If we want to understand a way of life, we want to understand its social relationships, we want to understand the way people think, then we really do need to understand economics as a kind of base for that way of life. The problem-based approach in cultural anthropology really requires an understanding of economics because of issues such as stratification, inequality, class conflict, being the base for many social problems in society. It really raises issues for cultural anthropologists thinking about economic life, issues that are moral and issues that are ethical. And so cultural anthropologists want to understand economics and theorize economics to promote solutions to these kinds of problems.